Even with the ink barely dry on their marriage certificate, the porch board still smelled of fresh sawn pine. Rather than poetry or empty promises, he offered her a roof that wouldn't leak and a hearth that wouldn't smoke. Stepping across the threshold, she saw far more than just timber. She saw survival. Gideon drove the final nail into the porch railing just as the sun dipped behind the jagged spine of the Rockies. The hammer rang out, sharp and lonely in the dusk. He lowered the tool, his breathing heavy, and wiped a forearm across his brow. His knuckles were split, the skin calloused and stained with pine sap. He stood back and looked at what he had done. It wasn't a mansion. It was 4 rooms of solid, weather-stripped timber, anchored to the Colorado dirt by a foundation of river stone he'd hauled by hand. The roof was tightly shingled. The windows, actual glass shipped at great expense from St. Louis, faced east to catch the morning light. Inside, there was a cast-iron stove, a wide oak table, and a bed frame built strong enough to last a century. It had taken him 8 months. 8 months of living in a canvas tent, eating salted beans, and working until his shoulders screamed, all while the land slept under snow and woke to the mud of spring. Most men out here sent for a woman the minute they secured their claim. They brought soft-handed Eastern girls out to sod huts and dugouts, expecting them to keep house in a hole in the ground while the wind howled through the grass. Gideon had seen those women. He had seen the light die in their eyes after the first winter. He had seen them pack their trunks and beg for stagecoach fare back to Ohio or Pennsylvania. He wasn't going to do that. He wouldn't ask a woman to share his life until he actually had a life to share. That night, sitting at the heavy oak table by the light of a single kerosene lamp, Gideon pulled a piece of parchment from his saddlebag. He dipped his pen in ink. He wasn't a man of many words, and he certainly wasn't going to lie. I am 34 years old. I own 160 acres in the Colorado Territory. The soil is fair. The winters are hard. I do not drink, and I am not a violent man. I have built a house. It has 4 rooms, wood floors, and a good stove. I need a wife who is not afraid of work, and in return, I will provide for her and treat her with respect. I will send a train ticket to whoever accepts. He signed his name, Gideon Hayes, and folded the paper. He mailed it the next morning to a newspaper in Boston. 2,000 miles away, the deafening clatter of the Lowell textile mills was slowly robbing Cora Miller of her hearing, her youth, and her lungs. She was 28. By city standards, she was an old maid. Her hands were scarred from the flying shuttles of the looms, and she spent 6 days a week breathing in a snowstorm of white cotton dust. Her parents were gone, taken by the cholera outbreak of '71. Her meager savings went to rent for a windowless room she shared with 3 other mill girls. There was no romance in her life. There was only the shift whistle, the aching cold, and the terrifying, creeping certainty that she was going to die in this soot-stained city without ever having owned a single thing of her own. Cora found the newspaper abandoned on a bench near the boarding house. She read Gideon's advertisement 3 times. It was the lack of romance that caught her eye. Other men in the matrimonial columns wrote of sweeping western vistas, of striking gold, of looking for an angel to grace their camp. They sounded like fools. Gideon Hayes sounded like a man who knew exactly what he was asking for. I have built a house. It has 4 rooms, wood floors, and a good stove. A good stove, wood floors, respect. Cora didn't agonize over the decision. She was too tired for fear and far too cynical to hold out for love. She bought a stamp, borrowed a pen, and wrote her reply on the back of a mill receipt. Mr. Hayes, I am 28. I am healthy, though I cough when the air is thick. I can bake, mend, and keep a clean floor. I do not expect a rich man, only an honest one. Send the ticket. I am coming. 3 weeks later, the envelope arrived at the boarding house. Inside was a one-way ticket to Oak Haven, Colorado, and a single $10 bill for provisions on the journey. No flowery letter, no romantic promises, just the means to escape. Cora packed her life into one battered leather trunk. She left her loom. She boarded the train. She didn't look back. The train hissed steam over the dusty wooden platform of Oak Haven. Cora stepped down, adjusting the wide brim of her hat against the blinding high-altitude sun. Her gray wool traveling dress was heavy with soot and ash from the 4-day journey. Her legs ached, and her stomach was hollow. She stood by her trunk, the wind whipping dust around the hem of her skirt, and scanned the platform. There were a few ranchers, a station master, and a tall, broad-shouldered man standing near a buckboard wagon. He had taken off his hat, revealing dark hair flattened by the brim. His face was weathered, deeply lined at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun. He wore a clean canvas shirt and dark trousers. He wasn't handsome in the way men in magazines were. He was rugged, rough-hewn, looking as though he had been carved directly from the landscape around him. He caught her eye. He didn't smile, but a subtle shift in his posture told her he knew who she was. He walked over, his boots heavy on the boards. "Miss Miller?" His voice was a deep, quiet rumble. "Mr. Hayes," she replied. She forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let him see the exhaustion trembling in her knees. "I'm here." Gideon looked at her. He took in the plainness of her dress, the defensive set of her jaw, the dark circles under her gray eyes. She looked brittle, like a woman who had been asked to carry too much for too long. But there was steel in her spine. She wasn't shrinking away from him. "The ride to the property is about an hour," he said simply. He reached down and hoisted her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, carrying it to the back of the wagon. They went to the courthouse first. It took 10 minutes. The magistrate mumbled through the vows while a stray dog slept in the corner of the room. Gideon said, "I do," with a firm, unwavering voice. Cora echoed him, her voice dry. He slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her scarred finger. It fit perfectly. He had guessed her size. When they climbed back into the wagon, the silence between them stretched out, wide and intimidating. The horses set a steady pace out of the town, leaving the scattered wooden buildings behind. Soon, there was nothing but rolling prairie grass, sagebrush, and the distant snow-capped peaks of the mountains. Cora gripped the edge of the wooden seat as the wagon hit a rut. "It is very big out here," she murmured, almost to herself. "Takes some getting used to," Gideon replied, keeping his eyes on the horses. "The wind never really stops. But the air's clean." He was giving her an out, she realized, reassuring her about her cough. It was a small, practical kindness, and she appreciated it more than poetry. They rode for miles. Cora's anxiety began to mount. She had read the stories of mail-order brides who arrived to find their new husbands living in squalor, drinking their money away, or hiding 3 wild children from a previous marriage. She braced herself for a shack. She braced herself for a dirt floor. She had lived in poverty before. She could survive it again if she had to. "Just over this rise," Gideon said, pulling back slightly on the reins. The wagon crested the hill, and Cora caught her breath. It sat in a valley near a winding creek, shaded by a few ancient cottonwood trees. It was a real house. The timber was fresh and unpainted, glowing warm and golden in the afternoon light. A covered porch stretched across the front. A stone chimney rose proudly from the shingled roof. Gideon pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He tied off the reins and climbed down, moving to help her. He didn't offer his hand to be gallant. He offered it because the drop was steep. She took it. His palm was rough, hot, and calloused. He grabbed her trunk and walked up the 3 wooden steps. He pushed the front door open and stood aside. Cora walked past him and stepped over the threshold. The smell hit her first: cedar wood, lye soap, and the faint, clean scent of ash from the hearth. She stood in the center of the main room. Beneath her boots, the floorboards didn't creak. They were tightly joined, swept, immaculate. To her right was a stone fireplace, built with an obsessive symmetry. To her left was the kitchen area. She walked slowly toward it. There were cabinets, real wooden cabinets with iron hinges. A gleaming black cast-iron stove sat against the wall. On the heavy oak table in the center of the room, someone, he, had placed a small chipped mason jar filled with wildflowers. Cora reached out and touched the edge of the table. The wood was sanded perfectly smooth. She traced the joint where the leg met the tabletop. It was dovetailed, not nailed, dovetailed. Hand-carved and locked together with a precision that spoke of endless, patient hours. She turned slowly, looking at the door frames, the thick walls, the glass in the windows that kept out the wind. There were no drafts. There was no dirt. She looked back at Gideon. He was standing in the doorway, his large frame filling the space, watching her with a quiet, guarded intensity. He was waiting for her verdict. "You built this," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I did," he said. "The letter said you built a house. I thought—" She swallowed hard, fighting the sudden sharp prick of tears behind her eyes. She hadn't cried when her mother died, and she hadn't cried when she left Massachusetts. But the sight of these smooth floorboards was threatening to break her. "I thought you meant a cabin, a shack." "A man doesn't ask a woman to cross the country to live in a shack, Cora," Gideon said softly. It was the first time he had used her name. "Not if he intends to keep her." Cora stared at him. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the fresh cuts on his knuckles. She realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity what this house actually was. It wasn't just wood and stone. It was a promise. It was months of backbreaking labor, driven by the singular hope that a stranger might arrive, look at his work, and decide to stay. He had built a sanctuary in the wilderness, solely to prove he was worthy of her trust. Cora took a slow, deep breath. The air in her lungs didn't catch. It was clean. She reached up, pulled the long pin from her hat, and placed the felt brim on the beautiful oak table. "Show me how the draft works on that stove, Gideon," she said, her voice steady and ringing with a new, fierce kind of belonging. "I'm making a supper." Gideon's shoulders dropped, a heavy, invisible weight falling away from him. A small, genuine smile finally cracked the weathered lines of his face. "I'll fetch the wood," he said. Cora watched him walk out to the woodpile. She stood alone in the quiet, sturdy room, listening to the wind howling uselessly against the thick glass of the east-facing window. She crossed her arms, rubbing the scars on her hands, and looked around her home. November stripped the prairie down to its bones. The cottonwoods lost their leaves in a single brutal weekend of freezing rain, leaving the branches looking like black wire against a bruised iron-gray sky. The wind did not blow. It slammed against the earth in heavy, rhythmic waves. Cora learned the harsh mathematics of survival. 2 cords of wood meant a week of warmth. A frozen water pump meant boiling snow for morning coffee. A drop in the barometer meant securing the barn doors before the sky went white. In the Lowell mills, work was a frantic, deafening scramble against a clock. Here, work was a slow, deliberate march against the elements. She and Gideon moved around each other in the small house like a pair of seasoned hands on a ship. There was no romance in the traditional sense. He did not buy her ribbons. She did not sew his initials into his handkerchiefs. But when she woke at dawn, shivering under the heavy wool quilts, she would hear the quiet scrape of the iron match and the crackle of kindling. Gideon always woke 20 minutes before her to pull the icy chill from the room so she wouldn't have to step onto a cold floor. In return, Cora made sure he never went out to the timberline with a hollow stomach. She learned to bake bread that didn't crumble, using a sourdough starter she kept warm near the stove. She learned to butcher the rabbits he snared, ignoring the sharp copper smell of blood to preserve every ounce of meat. She patched his canvas coats with thick wax thread, sealing the seams against the biting drafts. They spoke in the practical language of people keeping death at bay. "Barometer is dropping," Gideon said one Tuesday evening, setting a heavy pail of water on the kitchen floor. He pulled off his leather work gloves and flexed his stiff fingers. "I'll bring in the rest of the split oak," Cora replied, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. The blizzard hit an hour past dark. It did not announce itself. One moment the night was violently black. The next, the windows were blinding white, plastered with driven snow. The house groaned as the gale hit the western wall, a deep, unsettling sound, like a wooden ship taking a rogue wave. Cora stopped washing the dinner plates. She gripped the edge of the copper basin, her knuckles turning white. In the city, a storm meant damp boots and a drafty room. Out here, a storm was a living, breathing thing trying to pry the roof off and bury them alive. She looked up at the ceiling. The pine beams creaked. Gideon was sitting by the hearth, oiling his rifle. He stopped, the rag pausing over the blued steel. He watched her for a long moment. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He knew she was too smart to be told there was nothing to fear. Instead, he stood up, walked over to the corner of the room, and tapped his knuckles against the thickest vertical timber. "It's a mortise and tenon joint, Cora," he said. His voice was a low, steady rumble beneath the screaming wind. "The beam doesn't just sit on the post. It's locked inside it, pinned with a 2-inch oak dowel." Cora turned to look at him. He moved to the window, gesturing to the thick frame. "The glass is seated deep, glazed twice, and the foundation stones are sunk 3 feet into the dirt below the frost line. The wind can push all it wants. There's nowhere for the wood to go." He wasn't trying to soothe her emotions. He was giving her the architecture of her own safety. He was offering her facts. Cora felt the tight, cold knot in her chest begin to loosen. She walked over to the timber he had tapped. She placed her palm flat against the raw, sanded wood. She could feel the vibration of the storm outside, an angry, frantic buzzing. But the timber itself did not shift. It held fast. "You built it deep," she said quietly. "I built it to last," Gideon corrected. He looked down at her, his dark eyes catching the amber light of the kerosene lamp. "Go back to your dishes, Cora. The house will hold." She went back to the basin. That night, lying beside him in the darkness, listening to the ferocious howl of the wind, she didn't lie awake counting the hours. She closed her eyes, anchored by the steady rise and fall of Gideon's breathing, and slept through the storm. For the first time in her life, she trusted the roof over her head. Spring came to Colorado not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent thaw. The snow turned to heavy, sucking mud. The creeks swelled, tearing chunks of earth from their banks. But the air lost its biting edge, and the harsh, blinding white of the prairie gave way to a bruised, brilliant green. Cora's cough, which had rattled in her chest since she left Massachusetts, was gone. The clean, thin air had scrubbed her lungs out. She had put on weight. Her hands, once stained with machine oil and cotton dust, were now calloused from axe handles, hot iron skillets, and lye soap. She had never felt stronger. In late May, the mud dried enough for the wagon to make the trip into Oak Haven. They left at dawn. Gideon drove, the horses stepping high and eager in the warming air. When they reached the town, it was bustling with ranchers and homesteaders buying spring seed and replacing broken tools. Gideon handed Cora a small leather pouch. It was heavy. "Reckon we need flour, salt, and coffee," he said, not meeting her eyes directly. "Whatever's left. Buy what the house needs." Cora took the pouch. "What the house needs, or what I need?" "Oh, same thing," he muttered, pulling his hat down slightly. "I'll be at the blacksmith." Cora walked into the general store. The air smelled of peppermint, kerosene, and cured leather. She ordered the staples, carefully calculating the cost in her head. She had enough left over for 2 yards of decent muslin cloth. She had been wanting to sew proper curtains for the east-facing windows to soften the glare of the morning sun. As she waited for the clerk to weigh the coffee, a woman stepped up next to her. She wore a hat piled high with silk flowers that looked ridiculous against the dusty backdrop of Oak Haven. It was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. "You're the Hayes bride, aren't you?" Mrs. Gable asked. Her voice dripped with that particular brand of pity reserved for the wealthy when speaking to the working class. Cora stiffened. "I am Cora Hayes." "Yes." Mrs. Gable sighed, touching a gloved hand to her collar. "It must be terribly hard for you. I told Mr. Gable just the other day I simply don't know how those mail-order girls survive it. Out there in the absolute middle of nowhere, living in those dreadful, drafty little boxes. It must be a terribly lonely, hard-scrabble life." A year ago, the mill girl inside Cora would have looked down, accepted the pity, and shuffled out the door. The old Cora believed she was exactly what the world told her she was, a desperate spinster who had sold herself for a meal ticket. But the woman standing at the counter wasn't a mill girl anymore. Cora turned slowly. She looked at Mrs. Gable's spotless gloves. She thought of Gideon, breaking the frozen earth with a pickaxe so she wouldn't have to haul water as far. She thought of the oak table, dovetailed and perfectly smooth. She thought of the roaring fire that was always waiting for her in the dark. "My husband," Cora said, her voice carrying the cold, sharp edge of a drawn knife, "built our home with his bare hands. There is not a draft in it. The floors are swept, the pantry is full, and the roof does not leak." Mrs. Gable blinked, startled by the sudden ferocity in Cora's gray eyes. "It is hard work, Mrs. Gable," Cora continued, stepping an inch closer. "But it is honest work. and I am exactly where I chose to be. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have curtains to make." She paid the clerk, gathered her heavy burlap sacks, and walked out the door. Gideon was waiting by the wagon. He took the heavy sacks from her arms, loading them into the back. He glanced at her flushed cheeks, the set of her jaw. "Trouble in there?" he asked quietly. "No," Cora said. She looked up at him. She saw the dust on his shoulders, the deep lines around his eyes, the sheer, immovable solidity of him. "No trouble at all. Let's go home." They rode back as the sun began its slow descent, painting the distant Rockies in bruised shades of purple and gold. When they finally crested the hill and the house came into view, Cora felt a sudden fierce tightening in her throat. It sat in the valley, sturdy and quiet. Smoke was still curling faintly from the stone chimney. The cottonwood trees were budding with pale green leaves. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a palace. But it stood against the horizon like a fortress. Gideon pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He tied off the reins and climbed down. As always, he reached up to help her down. Cora put her hands on his shoulders. But instead of jumping down immediately, she stayed on the wagon step, bringing her face level with his. Gideon looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly in confusion. His hands rested on her waist. He could feel the solid, healthy weight of her beneath the wool dress. "You never asked me why I came," Cora said quietly. "You needed a ticket," Gideon replied. "I needed a wife. Seemed plain enough." "I came because I was tired of being nothing," she said, her voice shaking just a fraction. "I was tired of owning nothing and being owned by the factory whistle. I came because I wanted something that was mine." She reached up, her calloused, scarred fingers brushing against his weathered cheek. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, just a millimeter, a nearly imperceptible surrender. "You built the house, Gideon," she whispered, "but you gave me a home. You gave me a life." Gideon's jaw tightened. The stoic, unmoving rancher swallowed hard, his dark eyes suddenly shining with an emotion he didn't have the words to express. He didn't write poetry. He didn't make grand speeches. Instead, his large hands tightened gently on her waist. He lifted her off the wagon step and set her softly onto the solid Colorado dirt. "I'll stable the horses," he said, his voice thick and rough. "Go on inside. It's getting cold." "I'll start the fire," she said. Cora walked up the 3 wooden steps. She pushed open the heavy front door. She stepped over the threshold, breathed in the smell of cedar, ash, and safety, and closed the door behind her. If Cora and Gideon's story of resilience, grit, and finding real love in the hardest of places struck a chord with you, don't let the journey end here. Hit the like button to show your support for grounded human storytelling. Share this video with someone who appreciates a genuine Western romance, where actions speak louder than words. And make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next frontier tale.